I will call the meeting to order and invoke the May 2020 resolution adopting procedures for public meeting. We'll be operating under a virtual meeting today according to that continuing resolution. First on the agenda, I guess any comments, questions, public comments? Go ahead, David.
We've got somebody joined that I can't see that just says director, and who's this? So not Krista, not Marcy, not Tony, not Ginny, not Mike.
Could it be Zach?
Sorry?
Could it be Zach?
It could be, but Zach just told me that he's going to be late. So I don't
okay.
Okay, well, it's likely a board member because of the link they use. So we'll figure that out as we move along.
Remind them to unmute to make sure.
Sure, if you're trying to speak to us, unknown Zoom participants, you'll have to unmute. Although I don't see the mute on. Okay, go ahead, Mike. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay. All right. Well, first, we have a quick update on the Employee Handbook Working Group, which is going full speed ahead. David, are you able to pull up and share that working document?
I am.
So I think the last thing we reported probably at last month's full board meeting was that we'd sort of zeroed in on a list of sections. And we had at that time a kind of a working list of topics. And what we've done is filled in the sections with all the topics we've identified or brainstormed so far. And then we've even gone so far as to, within under specific topics, started to fill in some bullet points of some of the subtopics that will be covered there. A couple things that are also happening, we're sort of color coding. I can see at the first bullet's under number 2. Some of these topics within the handbook will just be links to an underlying policy that might come from the city of Charlottesville. Some of them might be, a few sentences where Jmrl has supplemented something from city of Charlottesville and then a link. But we've done some color coding to start to identify what are things that we need to either supplement or write ourselves versus things that we're just going to simply rely on, what's already in place from Charlottesville Working Group. We want to, I think the next meeting of this group is in about 2 weeks. And the idea is to have this sort of outline filled out enough to the point where we'll then share that with staff. We're still sort of in a brainstorming mode in terms of, hey, what are the topics we need to cover or what are the questions we need to cover? But staff are going to have good feedback for that in terms of things that they kind of day to day don't know where it's written down in one place, things that maybe when they were new, they kind of learned about. And again, the goal here is to get everything that's part of sort of Jmrl practices. I think there's a lot of stuff that's sort of a daily or organizational, institutional practice that just isn't written down in an organized fashion or in a sort of a centralized spot. So that's, I think, something that I'm hearing from the staff managers that are part of the group that they see as a big goal, a big benefit of this. I do see this in my mind as ending up as sort of 2 documents. The level we're working on right now is really everything staff needs to know. Some of that is procedural level. I think a lot of it, as we get the real examples in front of us, I'm starting to understand that a lot of this is sort of at a procedural level. But there certainly are some, there's still an open question of, some of it, I think there's going to be underlying policy that we want to put in place as well. But I'm sort of envisioning this as what's going to end up as 2 documents, something that might be called an employee handbook that's sort of the go-to reference manual for employees that includes all the procedures that have kind of applied to them day to day. And then I think sections of that will point to underlying policies. So there will be a collection of personnel policies. And I still think that those can be in a separate policy document from the sort of the public facing library policies, which deal more with sort of the operations that interface with it or apply to the public. So that's an open, it's still an open issue, but that's sort of where, just a heads up of where I see it possibly going, you know, after further discussion. But this can be available to be shared if anyone's interested in looking over our shoulder or peeking in. David, maybe we'll send this to the trustees at the same time when we send it to staff in about 2 weeks.
Sure.
And again, David will kind of carefully describe the status. What we're looking for at that milestone or juncture is just brainstorming of things that need to be covered or questions or, you know, FAQs that you might have that we want to cover for reference. I sort of have one other thing to mention here, but I'll take a break and see if anybody has questions so far.
So you're talking about sending it around to the trustees and the staff in draft form after the next policy, after the next working group?
Yeah, which it would be in about two weeks. And again, the scope, Marcy, is just the scope of what's being shared at that milestone is the outline. It's not any specific. So it might say, you know, one thing I remember from the discussion was tardiness. Okay, when do you count as tardy? And so different branch managers sort of had a different definition of what that might be. What would be shared at that milestone would not be our working definition. It would be the topic that, hey, we're going to cover the topic of tardiness, and we're going to have a standardized definition. So if that was ever a question in your mind, it might always account if I'm tardy, if, you know, under scenario A, B, or C, we're going to cover that and let you know in a standardized way. That's, in terms of scope, that's what we're looking at. Other comments or questions? I'm hearing, I guess those are just people's slacks going off rather than specific.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay. The last thing I want to mention on this topic is we did, David and I did share kind of a similar update as what I've just shared with you at the most recent personnel committee meeting, since these topics kind of intersect. It's sort of an intersection of policy and personnel. And we just made sure to keep them in the loop and asked that committee. We just kind of gave them the open-ended option to decide how they wanted to participate in this, whether they wanted to, you know, attend meetings and be specifically represented in the working group. And I think where they landed on was share the documents, maybe come to the meetings and provide them with updates so that they have the opportunity to, you know, from their experience, submit questions, comments, and so forth. And I think that's the approach that they landed on, that they would prefer to take. So that's it's a collaborative effort, and again, I'll say I'm very pleased with the members of the group. Have been very kind of enthusiastic about. We had a great discussion, kind of with the managers, just brainstorming. Hey, here's we've got a framework, and we could kind of go from top to bottom. Here's a bunch of issues that just come up day to day, and it'd be great to have it all written down somewhere. So I think everybody's pretty enthusiastic and motivated so far. Okay, if there are no other comments or questions on this topic, we can move to policy 4.232, conduct at Jmrl. So
Hi, Kathy.
Oh, hi, Kathy. So we discussed this at the last policy committee meeting and sort of got on the table. We looked at and a reminder, this is the conduct that applies to patrons or visitors. And so we tried to get on the table. Are there any issues that are sort of not being covered that we want to enhance or update? And there are a few tweaks, but by and large, I think everyone was satisfied with the scope of what was being covered. We did talk through just some rewording of some of the intro sections to make it a little more welcoming and user-friendly. We got a very nice assist from Scottsville branch manager Megan England, who's really a very skilled wordsmith. And so we have a a draft version that you've seen in your handouts shared to you in advance. And maybe David can put that on the screen. But what I'd like to do now is just go through that, do any final wordsmithing, last call for topics that need to be covered or adjusted. And ideally, we'd get this in a place where we can share that at today's board committee meeting, so for possible adoption next month. But the floor is open for comments or questions on the current draft version.
I think most of the changes were pretty cosmetic. Mike wanted to go for a friendlier tone, a more welcoming tone. And that was the goal here. The other things were just little clarifications. The only real major addition was staff, including myself, were interested in something that clarified what disorderly conduct is, and basically says that if you are disrupting somebody else's use of the library, then you're in violation of this policy.
David, back on that intro of going back and forth on functional and welcoming, and I think I'd rather have welcoming and functional. I know it's a little silly, but it's just a matter of emphasis. But I do think both concepts are important. We went back and forth on this word functional.
We talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah. But I think it's important. We want to be a welcoming space, but there's also the library has a purpose. And so that I just want to make sure that's conveyed in some way.
Okay, if there's no objections to that, we just need to make sure that the board is aware that's a change.
Yeah. Should we quickly go through one by one, and then if there's no comments, I guess it sounds like people are satisfied. So following forms of conduct are considered improper. Just David already covered number A, behavior that disrupts. D, vaping has become a thing since this was last looked at, and we wanted to clarify about that. H, again, is just a rewording to be more concise. I, we mentioned last month that this used to be covered in another policy, which has sort of been rolled up elsewhere. So it needed to be covered somewhere. And this is sort of the best place because it is something behavior by a patron.
Mr. OCD points out that there's a period after bullet point H and I, but not on the others.
I thought there, you're right. Yes. I love it.
It's the only thing I'm good at.
Okay. In terms of food and drinks, we had talked about again last month. We just took hot versus other, and this seemed to be my recollection from last month is this seemed to be the right level of detail that managers were happy with. 5 is just simply a rewrite of the same thing. 6 is a rewrite of the same thing. 7, I'll just note, you might have noticed, we're suggesting visitors, again, I guess we use the word patrons elsewhere. Visitors we felt was more friendly and more widely understood. I could justify it by saying if this is sort of something that's being printed out into the library, we want to use a better language. I do think there's an opportunity for staff to reformat this into sort of a poster where there's sort of more, just fewer bullet points and shorter. And then maybe at the end, there's a link to say, if you want all the details, go to conduct in Jmrl. That's up to staff. But if you were to do that, then it wouldn't be as important to be quite as friendly, user-friendly here. You could go back to patrons. I don't know. I'm just bringing it up in case somebody has any opinions one way or the other on this. Not hearing a strong opinion.
I
Okay.
like visitors because patrons assume that they're card holders, registered card holders, and we have a lot of visitors that are just visitors. So, I think, again, it sounds more friendly too. And just FYI, Mike, we do post this and put it in previous days at least. We post it, but we also put it in holders around the library, plastic freestanding type of holders. So as long as it's one page, we're good.
Yeah, I think it will end up as one page.
Yeah.
You know, because we've taken a few things out. I think I'm just suggesting, and it's really up to the branches and David. Even this is sort of a big wall of text. That's it's still a little bit. It's the best balance we could strike as being able to kind of describe things clearly and cover the bases. But you know, I could imagine an even simpler version of this. You know, that's more colorful and poster-like, that then points back to this. So I guess my thought is visitors are ultimately bound by this, or patrons are ultimately bound by this, but this doesn't have to be, but just like they're bound by a bunch of other stuff in the manual, this doesn't have to be the exact version we present to them, you know, in the space.
I think we'll look at that, Mike. I think that makes sense to me because there are really maybe, like, Krista, how many of these do we actually use or concern most of our patrons on a regular basis?
I would say earlier, like 5 years ago, 7 years ago, we would use it more often than we had in the last few years. I think, you know, it was just an education process early on, but once, you know,
Yeah. So
we haven't had as many issues.
I mean, it would be nice to have something that, you know, right. We've got folks that are very talented at making good signage, so we could make something that's a little bit more user friendly, probably. That
It's
just gets to the
style point, but it's
Just to show my OCD, I think the period needs to go back on I, because that is a full sentence. Compliance with copyright laws is the responsibility of the user.
I always thought that subheads didn't have periods, but that heads did. I mean,
Well,
but I haven't studied this. I have not studied the style manual in decades, so I could be wrong.
the style manual, I'm not sure anybody's studied in decades. I remember it, but
Okay.
that's been what, 50 years ago now?
well, it's true that all the other
Well,
points
but you've got a
are
period
not
after willful violation of copyright laws. It seems to me that ought to be a semicolon if you want to have that sentence, compliance with copyright laws and the use of library equipment is the responsibility of the user. It's just, that's a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
So it needs to have some sort of terminal punctuation on it. Sorry.
No, I think it's right.
I would land with Marcy here. I think it's not parallel to the other. The reason it's
not.
different,
And
not
it's the
parallel
only one.
which is okay, but
Yeah.
But given the different construction, that's why there's a period.
David, do I have rights to this in Google Docs? Because I see it in screen share, but I don't see it in the Google Docs directory. How's that work?
You have rights to the folder called Policy Committee, which I shared with you a week or two ago.
Oh, that one. Okay, that's
Yeah,
where
it's inside that folder.
Got it.
It
Okay,
wouldn't be an individual doc.
got it. Thank you.
I have a question. What does that do to the willful violation of copyright laws, which is not a sentence but does have a period?
Well, that's why I was suggesting that you put like a colon there.
Oh yeah.
Or you could leave off that period and put the compliance with copyright laws sentence into brackets. That's just grantsmanship writing.
I think colon and period, but then do you have a capital C for compliance?
That's okay to have a capital C there for a full sentence within a colon.
Oh shoot! I'm just trying to get all the changes here so we can note them for the full board. Tony, did you find it?
No, but I'm still looking. Don't worry. No need to hold up the. I mean, I can certainly see it right on the screen, so that's no big deal.
And David, you have some leftover point, yeah, there you go.
Thanks.
Okay, and then I think we're down to 8. So again, just kind of clarifying and tweaking the wording on animals. Okay, and then David, what's on the, the last? So the last is just the sort of a friendlier version of, hey, this means you.
And the other thing, Mike, that was a good suggestion at the top was we removed the effective date there. I think was added when there was a major change upcoming, maybe the food or the cell phones or something like that. And this was set out in advance to point to tell people like this is going to happen, but it's no longer that necessary.
We have sort of a natural break anyways, in the sense that people haven't been in the building for some time.
Yeah, like our list of issues with conduct have gone way down.
Yeah, and the only thing is that now we are letting people back in the building, but they cannot have food or drink right now. And so that's just
Right.
a aberration due to COVID.
Right.
We've got plenty of signage about that. And there are other kind of COVID protocols that become conduct issues, when it comes to masking or things like that, but they're covered in our guidelines for that. They kind of are temporarily superseding the food and drink here.
And David, we will have at the bottom then the updated, a date of when this was last updated.
Yeah, whenever the board.
Okay. Because it is helpful to know the last date it was reviewed.
We need to, right, so that we can maintain it.
Okay. Last call for, well, let me ask it this way. Are we ready then as a committee to propose this version to the board for adoption?
I think so.
I'm seeing nods and no other comments. Okay, so we can move on to sort of a look at, I guess, David, let's look at the policies for review. I'm going out of order slightly, but this is more of a heads up. And these are again, we currently have a sort of a 10-year practice of reviewing each policy at least once every 10 years. And so these are the ones that have not been reviewed by a policy committee since 2011. So staff training, I think, might end up in being covered by the personnel or employee handbook. Vehicle use, same thing. Parking, probably the same thing. Memorials and portraits we're going to look at today. And then the remaining are disposal of equipment, group visits, interlibrary loans, the websites, and emergencies. Between now and our next committee meeting, I'll come up with a kind of a proposed roadmap for which meetings to cover which of these. But I just wanted to give you a little context about the list and the ones we're looking at today, memorials and portraits. I know, David, emergencies was high in your list at one point.
Well, actually, that was emergency closings.
Okay.
Which is a separate.
I see. All right. So unless anybody has any input right now, we'll come up with a sensible, proposal for getting these covered in the remaining 5 policy committee meetings in 2021. But again, I think a couple of these will be, in my mind, can just be naturally covered during the employee.
Mike, just a heads up to the committee that the staff equity committee is starting to work on an anti-racism policy that we would like to some point present to the policy committee to review and pick up.
Okay.
So the timeline for that will likely be in 2021, hopefully this spring, so that this committee can get it in the pipeline. But anyway, just to put it on the radar, it's not one of these, but that committee is hoping to get that to this body.
Right. So that's a great point as far as the roadmap, which is what we're talking about. Okay, so then we can, with that context in place, we can pull open the portraits and staff memorials. And these are kind of in line or a good segue with some things we talked about with the unsolicited gifts policy. And we'll just open this up for, open the floor up. Essentially, it says there's no portraits except for some that are grandfathered. You know, one sort of open source of vagueness is it's not clear which ones might be grandfathered. I mean, of course, if you look on the walls, you got to assume whatever's up is grandfathered, but it's kind of not written down anywhere.
Yeah, I'm aware of at least a few.
It looks a little circular, doesn't it? The first section and the third section, because you're referring to this policy.
Oh yeah, this needs to be changed.
You might as well, we can start redlining right now, I guess.
That doesn't, you're absolutely right, Marcy. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, it also kind of doesn't make sense if you're saying there's no portraits, and how could there be a donation of a portrait?
Well, it could be a portrait of Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, right?
There you go. You're right.
This strikes me as being like much of our policy manual reactive to something, like something happened the year that this went into play that led the board at that time to say, geez, we better get something up there. I'm aware of a portrait of Miss Bumpus and Louisa. There's a portrait of Roland Buford at Gordon Avenue in the African American collection. Jenny, do you have any portraits up? No.
And a portrait is different than a display like of Gregory Swanson.
Yeah, a portrait is a picture of someone.
We are not planning on anything permanent regarding Gregory Swanson with the Swanson case courtroom and the context on that.
Well, the plaque that's already in there is permanent.
Yeah, okay. Just, that's the only thing that came to mind right away because patrons have asked for something that would provide context, and it wouldn't be a portrait necessarily, but it might include a display board with some information.
Right. The history of the library display that the Historical Society is working on likely will have some imagery in it, but I wouldn't consider that to be a portrait. It's going to be
Right.
like text and pictures of people, pictures of the library, things like that.
But I think it's a good point. We'd want to make sure that this doesn't exclude exhibits, even if it's a sort of a permanent exhibit.
Do we need to have a formal definition of a portrait, or is that overkill?
Do we need this policy? I mean, Mike, that's always the first question that we're supposed to ask, right?
Yeah.
Do we need this policy?
I guess
Was the policy to make sure, did someone want to put up a portrait of a staff member besides Roland Buford, and that's why this became a policy?
I would guess either that or a donation that came with some strings.
So it seems like the donations, the unsolicited donations
Cover that.
policy really covers this because the library has an opportunity to decide whether something's appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
I would probably can it, especially, David, given that there may be some questions about naming in the future.
Yeah, good point.
I'm just not sure what purpose it serves. Like and I could be wrong. Tomorrow, somebody could walk into my office and say, here's a portrait of, XYZ that,
Well,
I can't think of a good example, but somebody might show up and say, or Marcy someday will leave the board and somebody will say, here's a portrait of Marcy who led us through a very tough time during COVID. We want to put this up.
Turn it with its face to the wall.
Well, let me throw this. Here's a scenario. So someone says, hey, I want to fund the new wing of the South Side branch. And as a result, I'm not asking you to name the wing after me, but I'd like to, or my late wife, I'd like a portrait of my late wife recognizing the contributions we've made to funding this wing. Do we today want to say in advance, no, we're not going to entertain that sort of a proposal? Or do we want to say, well, unsolicited gifts say that we'll just handle that case by case? If we remove this, then it would be on really unsolicited gifts would say to me that the director can just decide. He's not required to bring that to the board.
Yeah, or if for any reason, likely I'm going to bring it to the board if somebody wants.
Yeah. But it's also, it could be a future director,
Right.
But so do we, as a committee, are we comfortable with that? It could be helping that future director in some way by giving him something to point at, him or her, that, hey, we just don't, thank you for this generous offer, but we just don't do that way. Can we acknowledge your generous gift in some other way? At that point, the director doesn't have to have that conversation. I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, and how is this different than how we decide if we're going to name like the John Halliday Children's Room? Like, how did we decide that? We don't have a policy that says it's okay to name the children's room after John Halliday. So maybe Mike, the person, at the South Side Library wants to name a meeting room after their wife instead of having a portrait in the library. Isn't it the same thing?
Yeah, Bill has a meeting room named after him in Crozet.
I think the staff memorials would get at those examples because they're staff members in those cases. But the Halliday Children's Room does not include a portrait of John Halliday.
No, but how do we decide? I mean, to complicate matters, we don't have a policy that says when we will and will not name something after a former employee. I don't.
Right.
Well, to get back to the original issue of do we need this policy at all? I mean, really, what is a portrait? We're not going to go out and solicit. I mean, we're not going to go out and pay for a portrait to be put somewhere, right? So it was going to be a gift. I cannot see the library board saying, we're even for a donation, it's going to be a gift. In other words, so I honestly, I think the policy, this one needs to go. And now I return you to regularly scheduled programming where you were talking about the other thing.
But I'm not sure I'm there yet, Tony, because Krista's example is a good one. The board that was motivated to recognize Director Halliday had the option of, okay, we're putting we're signage with his name, but they had the option of putting a portrait of Director Halliday in that space. And again, do we want to say in advance, hey, we kind of don't do that? I think I'm in favor of saying we stay away from portraits as a guideline.
Right, me too. But I think that perhaps we can just fold that into the gift policy. I mean, because we're going to have to consider a portrait, and we're going to have to consider a gift. And if we just take the policy out, then the portraits become a gift, right?
Well, in my example, it was the library itself was creating this, recognition of Director Halliday. So in that case, that wouldn't be just covered by gifts.
It could be covered. You could still get rid of this portraits thing and cover that in the staff memorials, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be a memorial because Director Halliday is still amongst us,
Right.
Alive, but we still named the room after him. So maybe in the staff recognition and memorials or something, I don't know. You can still, because that one does say you don't do portraits, and we don't even have to refer to a policy. We can just say we don't do portraits of staff.
Right.
I don't know.
David, do you have any input on this as to whether one way or the other would make your job easier?
Yeah, I guess my thinking initially, and Mike as always brings up good arguments here, but my thinking initially was we don't need this because I'm hard pressed to see the scenarios that this covers happening, but they could be there. I mean, I could see something like think about how Grow Nelson worked so hard together on something, a big project that really was very successful in getting that library to happen. And there might be some impetus there. There might be reasons that someone would want a portrait of somebody in that group. I'm thinking of somebody very specific, that they would want to honor somebody who worked hard on that. And I wouldn't be comfortable putting a portrait up. So this would be, a policy, as Mike said, to point to that says no. But I think that also we, as Krista said, staff and up to myself could just say no for that. I guess my fear is if we don't have a policy there, are we going to have branch managers just accepting portraits of people? I mean, I really don't think that it's an issue.
Covered under the gifts policy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think,
how about no idolatry in the library? Yeah.
I think I'm leaning towards that we could do without this policy.
You're going to have somebody important in the community who wants their picture in the library as soon as you do that.
Well, I guess that's a good point, Jenny, is that's the type of
I
thing.
mean-
That's how we ended up with Ms. Bumpus's picture at the Louisa Library because she was so important to the building of that library. And I'm sure she's one of the ones kind of any other portraits that were accepted in the libraries before this policy was adopted.
So a patron comes in and says, well, why can't I have my picture on the wall? Because I see Miss Bumpus's picture is on the wall. And we say, well, it would be a gift to the library and we don't have to do that. And Miss Bumpus was accepted because that was a different time and place.
Which this policy covers. You would just point to it and say, here,
Grandfather.
we'll do that. We don't have portraits in the library.
I don't think, our interiors don't really lend themselves to portraits anymore. They're not decorated like that. But it's very hard to say no. You could have some community group that's devised this thing to honor somebody and they decide the library is the perfect place to have it. And this kind of stuff happens. I mean, we have a little war memorial in our lobby because somebody wanted it. And John Halliday tried very hard to say no to that and he wasn't able to.
Well, I guess maybe I changed my mind, Marcy. Maybe it's simple enough just to leave this and maybe change the wording here to say, we're not going to accept any portraits for anyone that's not already, what's the verb for portrait? Portraitized up on the wall or whatnot.
Portrayed is the
Portrayed. So basically remove the portraits in the library, would be restricted to any portraits that were accepted in the libraries before this policy was adopted, something like that.
and not have specific names like Crozet, Jefferson, and Madison.
Because there
I
are
think
more than
good
our.
idea.
Right. And does the bottom of the policy have the original?
I don't, that's a
adoption
great
date?
question. Oh, yeah, it does.
Yeah, okay, good, okay.
And I don't know that is, well, maybe, I can't think of any portraits that have been added since 2002.
We could ask, because 1991 is before my time, but there might be somebody that remembers why this was put into place in 1991.
Wait, where'd you get 1991?
Mine says, oh, whoops, sorry. I'm sorry, I was looking at the other one, staff memorials. That was 1991, sorry. 1991 might have been when Roland Buford, when that happened.
Yeah, Ms. Bumpus would have been later than that though, because it was probably 2002 when Louisa was built.
Right.
Yeah,
that
I was
that
looking at the
probably-
other policy.
Yeah, that was 2000, yeah, right, 2000.
Somewhere around there,
So I think I'm in agreement with the concept here. I don't love the wording because I think it's
Sure.
awkward.
I'm just doing this so that we're capturing the content that we
Yeah.
can wordsmith.
Do I feel strongly enough to suggest that we take it?
And I think since you've eliminated the names of the people who already have portraits up, I think you can take off that last sentence, that third section completely then. Since we're not going to allow any donation of portraits that are not already hanging in the library.
It's true.
So yes, this makes this a very short policy.
Well, so we could, we could combine it to portraits and memorials.
But,
But-
but a memorial might be a little bit harder,
Yeah, the
don't
mo-
you?
well,
Given the things that we've already
yeah,
discussed.
and the memorials are, I shorthanded I was referring to the existing policy of staff memorials, but really that's staff, and this is broader. This is sort of any portrait. So I think it's fine. Any portraits that were accepted in the libraries? I mean, it's really any portraits that are there now. I don't like, the part I don't like is exactly what just came up is people are, well, when was this adopted? And then we got to go do some historical records.
We could change it
So
that.
if it says it was adopted in 2002, then you can put that date there.
Hello.
Hi, Kathy.
Uh, Roland Buford passed away in 1989.
So that
So,
91 was probably him.
yeah, so 1989, and I'm assuming because his son probably donated a vast amount of money, because I know when I traveled to the Crozet Library, he was on the donor wall. And I'm thinking that's one of the reasons why his portrait, along with the work that he did with the bookmobile.
Mhm.
So that is the staff memorial one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, so that's not covered under this policy. It's covered under the other one. Because Mr. Buford was a,
He was a staff member, and isn't it just a small picture at the end of the bookcase there?
plaque. It's a small plaque at the
It's a
end of
plaque.
the case. It has like an etching of his.
So it's not a portrait. It says it may include plaques or book plates, but not portraits. So it's not really a,
I think I like this short and sweet.
Yeah, it's not gonna get much shorter than that.
Yeah.
I agree with it being short and sweet because we don't want to get into you put it up for me, but you didn't put it up for them, or he's not worthy. And it needs to be short and sweet and to the point.
Yep.
And Kathy, you're kind of agree with the basic idea that, hey, we want to not have new portraits going forward, even for people who are, you're pointing out that there's people who have been deserving in the past. It's just hard to draw the line, I suppose.
I think going forward, we need to call it what it is, So I'm hoping my portrait will go up, but
I saw your name in the paper the other day.
yeah.
I'm just joking. I think it should be, I think what you said was right, Mike.
Okay.
And I think, Mike, that if a future board was presented with a scenario that we're not thinking of now, that they could revisit this
Yeah, they
policy
can.
for that
They can.
specific reason.
It's just, it places where that bar would be
Yeah.
to do it. Okay, I can live with the awkward word, I think, for this, given that it's short. Okay, should we move to staff memorials then? So this says, the first thing I'm noticing, now that I have the context of the example Krista brought up, it says privately funded memorials for former library personnel are welcomed and encouraged. I would have sent, yeah, I guess the question is memorial any form of recognition? Does it really imply someone who has passed away? Yeah, I guess that would be my first question, is the definition. And if the children's library room is not a memorial, I mean, it's certainly a recognition of the, then where did that fall, I guess?
Didn't consult policy on that, I guess.
Yeah. Or maybe it's not, since it's not a memorial, then there's
Yeah,
no
that was
guidance.
a board level decision.
Yeah, the board definitely decided to do it. Was there any guidance that they follow, any existing guidance that they had to follow? Maybe not. So I guess the question question in my mind is, would we want something like this to cover all forms of recognition of staff members? Or does memorial have a more narrow and specific meaning?
Well, memorial means somebody's gone away
Okay, that's what it means.
in whatever context.
So the question is, do we want to keep it that specific, or do we want to broaden it to include recognition?
I guess I'd like to start again with, do we need this? You know, and again, it likely was a reaction to something that happened, you know, as Kathy mentioned, when Roland Buford passed, and then there was a recognition a few years later. That what did you say the date was here, Krista? It was right after that.
The date on this was adopted in 91, and Kathy said that he died in 89. So I don't know if there was a direct correlation, or maybe, you know, I don't know.
A bit of an odd thing to me. I mean, is it a solicitation for fundraising? Is this saying to the board and staff, like, we should be seeking funding for books and library materials based on
maybe here's where I see value potentially. A beloved staff member has left us, and there's a impulse throughout the staff, hey, we'd like to remember this person in some way. And then I think it'd be nice then to say, well, here's the guidance of how we do that, rather than just inventing the wheel, at that moment. Yeah, the privately funded is a little odd to me, because I could certainly envision recognizing a major contributor with library funds. I wouldn't have a problem with that. I mean, these aren't giant sculptures out front or anything. I don't think these are high budget issues anyway. So the private to me, I would kind of take out. I would just leave it. To me, where I might take this is, if we're going to have staff memorials, here's the guidance about the forms that those memorials would take.
We frequently do memorials for the members of the public do. Usually it's through buy a book.
Yeah, I was thinking we should mention that here somewhere.
They want to recognize somebody in their family or friend, and they get a nameplate put in memory of. Or the other option is that things show up in the obituary that says, please make donations to, and we try to get nameplates in those so that we know if somebody passed and people want to honor them. We do it basically via number 1 here. I don't know
but those aren't limited to staff.
No, it's frequently non-staff, and I don't think we have a policy on that per se. It's just procedurally how that gets.
Form, I just was looking for the policy. I don't see a policy. It's just the form, the buy a book form. Has a number.
Likely addressed at some place in the collection development manual. Meredith would know.
I think what that privately funded was meant to do, though, was to say the library does not feel that it is obligated to fund memorials for staff.
It could be.
I guess my thinking, Marcy, is that I don't envision these as high ticket items. It's more of the cost, so to speak, is just more of the hey, we're putting these kind of semi-permanent changes to our facilities in some ways. That's a higher cost possibly than the ticket, the dollar cost of it.
Yeah, I guess I would just be worried that people might expect that the library would automatically do this, which has not been the practice as far as I can tell.
No.
Mike, do you want to maybe you and I think about this and workshop it a little bit, and then we can share it around either via email or via the
We can. I think I'd like to understand, I guess we do only have a few minutes, understand from this committee kind of a sense of whether some guidance is useful in this area, or, I mean, one thing that's been on the table is, hey, we don't need the guidance at all. I think I would land on, it's probably useful to have guidance if we're going to have memorials to the forms it takes. Yeah, I guess give me 2 minutes of what would be the purpose of, and things, what would you like this policy to accomplish if we workshop it?
And again, as we were talking about with the portraits policy, can this be folded into the gifts policy somehow? Or does that make it too unwieldy, to make the gifts policy too unwieldy?
I guess my only thing there is we just finished that one, but that's
Yeah, I
fine.
know, I hesitated to bring that up.
Yeah. I think there are maybe some other issues there too that have come up in fundraising about naming and what staff can and can't do that are not really covered in the unsolicited gifts, which is now just gifts. So it might be useful. Maybe, Mike, this just needs to be transformed into something other that would, that might be too broad though, that would also cover, this comes up when you're fundraising about how do we determine what naming rights are available and what we would be willing, what the library is allowed to do. is
Yeah.
willing to do.
I mean, I think that's probably, I think we have no policy or guidance in
No,
place
we
for
don't.
that.
No. So
Oh.
maybe we need to be looking at a new thing that covers that and then also incorporates some of this.
Maybe we can see what some of our peer libraries have done in this area.
Always a good delaying tactic, yes.
All
Why
right.
start from scratch if,
Well, in the next 4 minutes, we're not going to rewrite this in a form to present to the board.
no.
So let's take the discussion and reopen it next meeting. And we'll probably do some, behind some of these topics have been raised in your minds. So let's have some email discussion, some workshopping, as David says, and then we'll, in other words, I don't want to start at the next meeting where we left off right now. I'd like to start at where we've moved the ball a little bit, with the benefit of us having been able to think about some of the things we brought up today.
Mike, I can bring this to the branch managers too, to see if they have experiences or thoughts about it as well.
Okay. And the other group would be people who have done fundraising.
Yeah.
Because I do think you have something there in terms of identifying that we don't have guidance for.
Yeah. To me, that seems like a more likely future scenario that we'll be dealing with.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Then I think we need to adjourn if there are no final comments or questions. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.